You weren't placed in a narcissist's life by accident. And no, you weren't there because you were naive, broken, or desperate. You were there because you had something they didn't and something they needed to survive. If you've ever asked, why me? This isn't about fate or karma, it's about psychology. And once you understand it, the guilt, confusion, and self blame begin to fall apart. If this is resonating, pause for a second, breathe, and remind yourself I wasn't weak for staying. I was strong for surviving. And if you're ready to understand this dynamic deeply and reclaim your sense of self, stay with me, because clarity is where healing actually begins. You were chosen because you carried emotional depth, not because you lacked strength or awareness. Emotional depth means you feel things fully, you listen carefully, and you are able to sit with another person's emotions without running away from them. People with narcissistic traits are drawn to this because they do not have that internal capacity themselves. They experience emotions in fragments, intense but shallow, dramatic but unprocessed. And when they encounter someone who can regulate, soothe, and contextualize feelings, it feels like relief. You became the emotional container they never learned to build within themselves. This depth often shows up as empathy, patience, and the ability to see potential rather than patterns. You likely gave people the benefit of the doubt, believed conversations could resolve conflict, and assumed accountability was possible because it was natural for you. That made you especially appealing. Your presence reduced their internal discomfort. Your reassurance quieted their insecurity. Your understanding softened their shame. None of this happened because you were weak. It happened because you were emotionally skilled in ways they were not. The tragedy is that emotional depth is often misinterpreted as tolerance. You didn't stay because you didn't see the red flags. You stayed because you believed emotional investment could lead to growth. You assumed mutual effort existed because it did in your world. But for someone who lacks emotional depth, your capacity becomes something to extract from, not reciprocate. Over time, your empathy was no longer appreciated, it was expected. Your forgiveness became a tool, your emotional labor became invisible. They did not choose you to love you the way you loved them. They chose you because your inner richness temporarily compensated for their inner emptiness. You made chaos feel manageable. You made disconnection feel like intimacy. And when you began to show signs of depletion, fatigue, boundaries, self-protection, that depth stopped serving them, which is often when devaluation begins. Understanding this reframes the entire dynamic. You were not too much. You were too real for someone who survives by avoiding their inner world, and emotional depth will always unsettle those who rely on control instead of connection. You felt familiar and safe to them because your empathy mirrored something they were missing but desperately searching for. People with narcissistic traits are often emotionally underdeveloped, not because they don't feel, but because their feelings were never safely held, validated, or integrated early on. When they encounter someone who naturally attunes, listens, and responds with emotional intelligence, it creates an immediate sense of comfort. You didn't just understand their words, you understood their moods, silences, shifts, and contradictions. That level of attunement feels intoxicating to someone who lives in emotional disarray. Your empathy created an illusion of home. You likely noticed their pain before they spoke it, adjusted your behavior to keep the peace, and anticipated emotional needs without being asked. That made interactions smoother for them. Conflict felt less threatening because you softened it. Accountability felt less confronting because you approached it gently. You brought emotional predictability into a life that internally felt unstable. To them, that didn't register as kindness, it registered as safety. But this safety wasn't mutual. While you felt connected, they felt regulated. While you believed you were building intimacy, they were experiencing emotional outsourcing. Your empathy absorbed their anxiety, their anger, their insecurity, and their self-doubt. You became the emotional buffer between them and their inner discomfort. That's why they could open up quickly, overshare early, or attach intensely at the beginning. It wasn't vulnerability, it was relief. Over time, this dynamic quietly shifts. What once felt like emotional closeness turns into emotional dependence. Your empathy stops being appreciated and starts being relied upon. You are expected to understand without explanation, forgive without repair, and stay calm while they destabilize. When you express hurt, confusion, or needs of your own, it disrupts the sense of safety they've grown dependent on. Your emotions become inconvenient because they can no longer be absorbed without cost. This is where confusion often sets in for you. You feel safe with them emotionally, yet increasingly unsafe being yourself. That paradox exists because the safety was one-directional. You were familiar not because you were known, but because you were predictable in your care. And predictability, to someone who fears emotional exposure, feels far safer than genuine reciprocity. You reflected parts of themselves they were unable or unwilling to face, and that is a powerful, destabilizing experience for someone who survives through denial and image management. When you live with self-awareness, integrity, and emotional honesty, your presence naturally acts as a mirror. You didn't have to point anything out or confront them directly. Simply by being consistent, accountable, and emotionally present, you highlighted the gaps between who they pretended to be and who they actually were underneath. At first, this reflection felt flattering to them. Your admiration, belief in their potential, and willingness to see good softened the discomfort of that inner split. You held up a version of them they wanted to believe in, but mirrors eventually reveal more than surface-level validation. Over time, your emotional clarity made avoidance harder. Your questions, even gentle ones, required self-examination. Your expectations for honesty, repair, and mutual respect challenged their defensive structure. Without intending to, you activated shame they worked tirelessly to suppress. This is where the shift often occurs. Instead of using the mirror for growth, they turn against it. Projection begins, traits they cannot tolerate in themselves, selfishness, insecurity, manipulation, lack of empathy, are unconsciously assigned to you. The discomfort they feel becomes something you are accused of causing. Your clarity is reframed as criticism. Your boundaries are labeled cruelty. Your emotional truth is dismissed as drama. This allows them to preserve their internal narrative while avoiding accountability. For you, this phase is deeply destabilizing. You sense something is wrong, but you are handed a distorted reflection of yourself instead. You begin to question your intentions, tone, and reality. You try to adjust, soften, explain, and shrink, hoping the mirror will return to being safe. But the truth is, the mirror was never the problem. The problem was what it revealed. You were placed in their life not to fix what they refused to see, but to encounter the limits of emotional avoidance. Your presence exposed the cost of living without self-reflection. And when someone cannot tolerate what they see in the mirror, they don't change the image, they try to break the glass. Your love temporarily stabilized the chaos they live with internally, and that is not a small thing. People with narcissistic traits often experience an ongoing sense of inner emptiness, emotional volatility, and fragmented self-worth. They may appear confident or controlled on the outside, but internally there is constant fluctuation between grandiosity and insecurity. When you entered their life, your affection, consistency, and belief in them acted like an emotional anchor. You brought calm where there was agitation, meaning where there was confusion, and continuity where there was fragmentation. At first, the stabilization feels like connection. They seem more grounded, more present, even more functional. You might notice they sleep better, regulate their moods more easily, or become temporarily kinder and more attentive. This creates the illusion that love is healing them and that your presence is transformative. In reality, what's happening is emotional borrowing. Your steadiness becomes the structure holding them together. Your reassurance patches over their self-doubt. Your commitment soothes their fear of abandonment without requiring internal change. This is why the bond often feels intense early on. You are not just a partner, you are a regulator. Your emotional availability keeps their inner world from tipping into chaos. But because this stability is external, it is fragile. The moment you need support, express limits, or pull back to care for yourself, the system destabilizes. They experience your autonomy not as healthy separation, but as threat. The calm you provided disappears and they feel exposed to emotions they cannot manage alone. Instead of learning to self-regulate, they attempt to regain control. This can show up as criticism, guilt, withdrawal, or emotional punishment. The relationship shifts from appreciation to entitlement. You are no longer loved for who you are, but demanded for what you provide. And as you grow tired, depleted, or emotionally exhausted, you may feel guilty for no longer being able to hold everything together. Understanding this is crucial. You did not fail when things fell apart. You were never meant to be someone else's emotional life support. Love can support growth, but it cannot replace internal stability. When your love stopped stabilizing them, it wasn't because you stopped caring, it was because you started needing care too. You were a mirror, not a mistake, even though the experience may have left you feeling confused, ashamed, or questioning your worth. When a relationship is built around distortion, manipulation, and emotional imbalance, it's easy to walk away believing you did something wrong simply by being yourself. But the truth is, your role was never to fail or to be discarded. It was to reflect reality into a space where reality was actively avoided. Your authenticity, emotional honesty, and capacity for self-reflection revealed what could not be sustained long-term. You showed what consistency looks like. You demonstrated what accountability feels like. You embodied emotional presence without performance. And in doing so, you unintentionally exposed how fragile the dynamic truly was. That reflection is not something everyone can tolerate. For someone whose identity depends on control and illusion, being seen clearly feels threatening, not connecting. Because the relationship eventually collapsed or turned painful, you may internalize the outcome as evidence that you were defective, too intense, too sensitive, or too much. That narrative is reinforced when blame is subtly or overtly placed on you. But mirrors don't create flaws, they reveal them. The discomfort they experienced wasn't caused by you. It was activated by the contrast between truth and avoidance. The breakdown wasn't proof that you were wrong. It was proof that the system couldn't survive honesty. This is why you often leave such relationships with heightened self-doubt, even though you entered with clarity. You weren't losing yourself randomly. You were responding to repeated distortions of reality. When you stop trusting your own reflection, it takes time to recognize that the mirror itself was intact all along. Your empathy didn't mislead you. Your intuition wasn't faulty. You were responding normally to an abnormal emotional environment. Understanding that you were a mirror restores agency. It shifts the story from "what did I do wrong" to "what did this dynamic require me to deny?" You were not placed in their life to be broken. You were placed there to reveal the truth, first to them and eventually to yourself. Your boundaries threatened the false self they worked hard to maintain, even if those boundaries were quiet, reasonable, and expressed with care. At the beginning, you may not have had many limits in place because the connection felt mutual and safe. Over time, as inconsistencies appeared, you naturally began to protect your emotional energy. You asked for clarity. You expected follow-through. You named what hurt. These were not acts of aggression or control. They were signs of self-respect. For someone whose identity depends on external validation and image management, boundaries feel destabilizing. They interrupt access. They challenge entitlement. They imply that another person exists outside of their control. Even gentle boundaries expose the truth that they are not all-powerful, not always right, and not immune to consequence. That realization directly threatens the constructed version of self they rely on to function. Because the false self cannot tolerate threat, the response is rarely introspective. Instead of adapting, they attempt to dismantle the boundary. This may look like guilt tripping, minimizing your needs, reframing your limits as cruelty, or accusing you of being selfish or cold. The goal is not resolution, it is restoration of control. When boundaries persist, escalation often follows. Affection may be withdrawn. Conflict may be manufactured. Your emotional safety becomes conditional. This creates a painful internal conflict for you. You are forced to choose between honoring your needs and preserving the relationship. Over time, you may start abandoning yourself to keep the peace, convincing yourself that your limits are unreasonable. But the discomfort you feel is not evidence of wrongdoing. It is the emotional cost of standing in your truth in a system that survives by erasing it. Your boundaries were not too much. They were simply incompatible with a dynamic that required access without accountability. And when someone reacts to healthy limits with punishment, it reveals that the relationship was never about connection. It was about control. Your exhaustion was never accidental. It was the predictable outcome of a dynamic that quietly required you to carry more than your share. At first, the emotional effort felt mutual. You listened, supported, reassured, and adjusted because you believed the relationship was a shared space where both people mattered. Over time, though, the balance shifted. You became the one managing tension, smoothing conflict, and anticipating reactions. You learned to monitor tone, timing, and mood, not because you were overly sensitive, but because emotional safety depended on it. This kind of fatigue builds slowly. There is no single breaking point, just a steady erosion of energy. You may have felt constantly on alert, replaying conversations, wondering how to explain yourself better, or questioning why simple needs felt so difficult to express. Emotional labor became your responsibility. Repair became your job. Stability became something you had to produce rather than something you shared. And because you were capable, it was assumed you could keep going. What makes this especially draining is the lack of recovery. When you are emotionally exhausted in a healthy relationship, care flows back to you. In this dynamic, rest felt dangerous. Pulling back triggered conflict. Needing space was interpreted as rejection. Your depletion was met with pressure rather than compassion. Over time, your nervous system stayed activated, creating a state of chronic stress that you may not have recognized until your body forced you to slow down. This exhaustion was not a failure of resilience. It was evidence that the system was unsustainable. You were functioning as an emotional regulator, conflict mediator, and stabilizer without support. Anyone placed in that role would eventually burn out. The confusion you felt was part of the design. When you are tired, you are easier to doubt, easier to control, and less able to trust your instincts. Recognizing that your exhaustion had a cause allows you to release self-blame. You didn't lack strength. You were giving strength where it was being taken but never replenished, and no human system can survive that indefinitely. Your role was never to save them, even though the dynamic subtly trained you to believe that if you loved harder, explained better, or stayed longer, something would finally change. This belief often forms because you saw glimpses of vulnerability, pain, or humanity that made you feel responsible for their healing. You understood their wounds, contextualized their behavior, and told yourself that compassion could bridge the gap. But understanding someone's pain does not make you accountable for fixing it. Over time, the relationship may have conditioned you to measure your worth by how well you could manage their emotions. When they were calm, you felt successful. When they were distant or reactive, you felt like you had failed. This creates a powerful illusion of responsibility. But healing requires self-reflection, accountability, and sustained effort from within. No amount of external love can replace that work. You were asked to do the impossible, to become the cure for something you did not cause. The deeper purpose of this experience was not their transformation, but yours. You were pushed to confront patterns you may have learned long before: overfunctioning, self-sacrifice, and equating love with endurance. The dynamic forced you to see how easily empathy can turn into self-abandonment when boundaries are missing. It revealed where you had been prioritizing potential over reality and connection over self-protection. Leaving, detaching, or emotionally withdrawing was not abandonment. It was awakening. Choosing yourself did not mean you lacked compassion. It meant you recognized your limits. The lesson was not about becoming harder or colder, but about becoming more discerning with your care. You were placed in that relationship to wake up to your own needs, values, and worth, not to disappear inside someone else's unresolved inner world.